by Anna Zalik, who's an associate professor at York University. She writes extensively on the oil sector, particularly comparing Mexico, Nigeria, and Canada. She will be speaking on different aspects of education and resources, neoliberalism, privatization, and resistance.
Well, I'll start by thanking Nitan Betsatoon for hosting all of these great events, and of course the First Nations, Port Credit, Mississauga, and others whose land we're on. I'm on a panel with people from whose work I've learned a great deal over the years, so that already puts me sort of in the junior position here. And also, I'm disappointed that Ricardo can't join us tonight because I've learned quite a bit from him just in the last couple of weeks and hearing him speak. I sort of tried to pass this off to a doctoral student in FES, Tania Hernandez Cervantes, who has left now for Mexico. And at the end, I'll read a poem that she wrote and asked me to share with regard to her sort of reflections on recent events in Mexico and how she sees the context there. So I guess there's four main points that I'd sort of like to make today around what's happened in the last now 2 months or so in Mexico. And that is that the killings, disappearances and killings of the teacher-students in Guerrero in late September should be seen in the context of all of the recent social movements resisting different kinds of reforms, largely privatization reforms of the education and energy sectors. And as Judy's pointed out, this is part of a longer cycle of repression and resistance that goes back to the way in which the pre-managed resistance from the 1940s and 50s onwards. But these recent reforms of the last year and a half further deepen sort of the neoliberal trends that were part of the implementation of NAFTA and that spurred the Zapatista movement that became sort of known internationally, although, again, as Judy's pointed out, that movement, she's pointed out in her work as well, was just one of many very significant movements coming out of rural Mexico that have challenged different kinds of repression and have sought sort of more substantive democracy. So that's the first point, is that really these killings are part of a context of repression that is around preventing the expression of tensions against the reforms, specifically of the energy sector and the educational sector. The second point is that the reform of the energy sector and the oil sector in particular, while it's been going on for decades really, since the late 80s, has really intensified and has spelled the massive layoffs of workers. And so there was, in one day, I think, when was it, in 2011 or 2012, 40,000 workers of the Central Electrical Authority were laid off. And the Canadian government is actually part of that. I'll talk about that a bit later. But the reforms that are part of the energy sector reforms and the educational sector reforms were made possible or have been facilitated by what many people have described as the context of impunity that has arisen from the so-called war on drugs. So under Felipe Calderón, who came to power, this is before the current presidency of Enrique Peña Nieto, but under Calderón, what happened was basically a context that some people have described as equivalent to what happened with George Bush after 9/11. So the drug war in Mexico, in a sense, solidified the rule of a government that was seen as largely illegitimate. Calderón barely won the elections. There was a lot of discussion about the fact that it was almost 50-50, that really the opposition, the PRD, should have won. And the subsequent war on drugs, which some people might have interpreted as sort of Calderón's refusal to make an agreement with narco-traffickers, that's been a long part of the history of control over the Mexican state. His refusal to do this then led to extreme, rising violence, wars against between the cartels and against people basically just living all over the country. And this made a context in which anybody who was engaged in anything that was seen as threatening to the state could be arrested, repressed, etc. under the guise that perhaps they're somehow associated with organized crime. So it really, has led to kind of a lot of fear within the state and was seen as a possible way of sort of crushing resistance, which it has not succeeded in doing, clearly. But that is part of the context in which all of this occurs. Now, the reform of the energy sector is part of the further opening up of foreign investment in the oil sector, in which Canadian capital actually plays a significant role. And so I'm not an expert on the Canadian mining sector in any way. I'm not an expert on Mexico, frankly, but and there are people in this audience who are, who might be able to talk more about this. But the role of the Canadian mining firms and their association with human rights abuses, to some extent, has been facilitated by the drug war. And Guerrero is now, in some recent articles in the Canadian Mining Journal, is described as holding this sexy gold belt, in which there's been a lot of investment of Canadian mining firms. So this sort of impunity allows for further kind of, to use a very masculinist term, penetration of Canadian mining capital into the area. So one of the sort of clarion calls of the movement against, as a result of the murder of the rural school teachers, the normalistas in Ayotzinapa, is the phrase "ya me cansé," I'm tired, or I'm fed up, or I'm sick of it. And this arose from the results of a news conference in which the Mexican Attorney General was answering questions from various people who were upset about the disappearance of the 43 school teachers. And after a couple of hours, he finally said, "Ya me cansé, I'm sick of this, close down the press conference." This led to a major sort of outcry over social media, where everybody was using the hashtag, and I don't tweet, so I don't really understand hashtags, but I'm sure many of you do, "Ya me cansé," which is like, yeah, well, if you're sick of it, then why don't you resign? And why doesn't the government resign? And so it sort of spurred this, kind of allowed the, melding of all these popular forces that were saying, the legitimacy of the government is gone. One of the other sort of statements that's been central to the movement is fue el Estado, it was the state, so the complicity of the local government, the state government, and the federal government with the crimes of the narco-traffickers. So there's, this general feeling, and it's frankly not only on the far left, but also sort of among liberals, that the legitimacy of the Mexican state has really kind of deteriorated. And this emerges from the fact that many people felt there's a large, critique of the Peña Nieto, when Peña Nieto was sort of standing for the presidency, his relationship to the major news channels was seen as, an example of the way in which the mass media was controlling public opinion, and this led to another major outpouring of student resistance, including at the private universities. So there was the sense that, the resistance was going out of the public universities and the public sector teachers movements that had frequently been the site of these really important struggles, and was also, within, frankly, groups that had previously been seen as the elites and the middle classes. We're also saying we're sick of the way in which, elite forces had been kind of in collusion with capital and with, frankly, drug cartels in a form that prevents real mass mobilization. So, one of the things that's kind of striking is that almost exactly a year ago, there was a major movement of teachers, so in September of 2013, that was crushed quite violently, really, in the Zocalo, in that main square in Mexico City, and those movements emerged out of the dynamics that Judy was describing, so the rural teachers movements in Guerrero and Oaxaca that have been quite strong in recent years. And in Oaxaca, for the last 25 years, there's been an annual strike of the rural teachers. In fact, in 2006, the social movements that many people here will probably remember in Oaxaca, one of the sort of central groups organizing those major 2006 protests were were the teachers in Oaxaca. And so this mass mobilization in September was put down by Mexican riot police, and even the CDC described it as such. The Mexican riot police had cracked down on the strongest challenge yet to President Enrique Peña Nieto's reform program. So that, you know, it was a mass sort of major violent attack against groups that were trying to prevent the reform of the educational sector. And among the aspects of that reform are standardized testing, which people in the teaching movements in North America are very familiar with as a way of sort of trying to prevent critical teaching in schools. So that was among the parts of the reform, was sort of a way of cleaning up and ensuring that you have good teachers. We're going to impose standardized testing. And another major aspect of it was that they would get rid of sort of the requirement of certain kinds of teachers' colleges. So exactly the spaces in which people might have mobilized and might have become, you know, had their consciousness raised and from a critical perspective, that these would be replaced by people just writing an exam as individuals. So it's the further atomization of the left, of labor movements around the educational sector particularly, and that was one of the areas that people were protesting against. And the group that was leading it was the democratic offshoot of the Mexican Education Workers Union, which is the CNTE, which was basically a group that was removing itself from the corporatist structures that the revolution, the pre-party, the institutional revolutionary party, don't be, you know, misdirected by the name of the pre, had you know, used to control labor movements, frankly, for much of the 20th century. The other major protest at the beginning of December a year ago occurred outside the Mexican Senate on the day that the petroleum energy sector reform laws were being put into practice. And so there was a major wall erected to prevent protesters from approaching the Senate, because the energy sector is seen as sort of the symbol of national sovereignty in the immediate post-revolutionary era. So, you know, in 1938, Lázaro Cárdenas, who Judy mentioned, was the president in power when the oil sector was nationalized, and that nationalization also involved the actual kicking out of foreign capital, so of British and American oil firms, and that is a real symbolic historical event within Mexico that brings people together around a national consciousness that's really quite explicitly anti-imperialist. And one of the outgrowths of NAFTA and of the gradual sort of erosion of these anti-imperial movements, or this anti-imperial sort of discourse, is kind of this slow agreement that, okay, we have to privatize the energy sector because it's not sufficiently efficient, so sort of this kind of, again, penetration of these sort of neoliberal values. We have to be able to compete on the global market, and as Pemex has to open itself up to foreign investment, the national oil company, in order to ensure that the Mexican economy is competitive. But, you know, the ability to encourage people to do this was partly the outgrowth of very, you know, explicit policies that actually disinvested in Pemex and the oil sector from the late 1980s on. So created the conditions in which, you know, there could be sort of justifiable need for foreign investment, because the government had not actually ensured that technology was kept to a level that, you know, the Mexican oil sector would be able to manage on its own. So, you know, the conditions were put in place to try and push forward privatization, and Canadian capital has been part of that. So I'll mention something now specifically around that. When doing some research in the last couple of years on Export Development Canada, I was surprised to discover with a grad student colleague of mine, Kimia Gomeshi, that TransCanada Pipelines was a major recipient of funds from Export Development Canada, which is Canada's export-import bank. And TransCanada Pipelines was receiving these funds for a lot of activities in the United States, but they were also receiving major EDC financing for activities in Mexico. And EDC financing was also going very directly into some sort of partnership, unspecified, around the privatization of the Mexican electrical sector, because the Comisión Federal de Electricidad was actually named on EDC's website as one of the recipients. So, the oil sector is clearly, posing itself in Canada as able to help with the modernization of the Mexican oil sector. And 50% of foreign mining concessions in Mexico are held actually by Canadian companies. And so on both the context of the oil and mining sector, because I'm kind of reaching my time limit here shortly, but I will mention that there's a Mexican journalist named Ana Lilia Perez who had to go into exile. She's now based in, I think, at the University of Texas in the Knight Center. And she wrote a couple of books, really quite outstanding books that have received various international prizes about the way in which privatization has been implemented under PAN and PRI governments. And her most recent one, called The Black Cartel, talks about the way in which Pemex has been penetrated by the drug cartels. And her previous book talked about the way in which the elites in Mexico were the beneficiaries of the privatization of Pemex because they received the contracts, the subcontracts from Pemex to implement different kinds of privatizing reforms. And basically her argument is that the drug cartels have been allowed to penetrate Pemex and to actually steal oil because of the fact that private elite capital in Mexico was making its way into the public national oil sector. And so that there's been sort of, more or less a fairly direct relationship, just like the movements are saying, it was the state, between the elites in various parties, frankly, including the PRD, as we see in Guerrero, and the drug cartels in profiting from the export of mineral resources. So I'll just close by reading this poem by Tanya. I should say about her research, she's studying the nopal sector just outside of basically the people who are growing cactus outside of Mexico City, and the way there's now sort of a growing international demand for cactus because of sort of health interests, and it's very interesting work. But anyway, the poem is called I Want to Live. All I want is to live the days when something happens in me or in what I see. That's why I want to look there where things happen that one should see, and never to forget and to feel how the force of a hand feels, an eye wide open, an arm in movement, and to give one's own life in defense of the eye, the hand, the arm, the whole body. Never forget, for example, that I saw a woman walking in search of a ruby. Ruby died many times. She was not a cat with 9 lives, but 7 deaths. 1, her death at the hands of the man who cut her to pieces. 2, the other, the judges who let him go. 3, the reporters, they turned to a new scandal. So many good scandals to choose from. 4, the indifference of the public. Families all went off together to see a good soccer match, or a bad one for all it matters. 5, her daughter made an orphan. 6, a killer came for her mother. 7, a trembling horror runs through a nation's womb. 7 ways to watch the disgrace unfold. The 7 leans back into the shape of a pistol, pulls the trigger, and shoots at the heart of the ruby. Things are happening out there. All I want is to live the days when I can go out and to see that nobody loses, an eye that sees, the arm that carries their son or daughter, their lives. I want things to happen to me, yes, and to live to remember it, without the dead bodies of women at my side.